Hello everyone, this is John Steinmetz coming to you from the Delano Heritage Center. We have Tom Delano as our guest and Debbie DeBeer alongside of us, and we can talk to Tom about his great-grandfather that the town was named after. So let's try that.
Great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, of course. And at that time, when I was going through it, I realized we needed to start making sure it found a home. And so I passed a lot of it on to the Washington County Historical Society. I don't know if you know Brent Peterson. Mm-hmm. I will certainly introduce you, but he has a lot of it because FR designed and built the Warden's House in downtown Stillwater, and it is now a museum. And so he has a lot of FR stuff, the books that were on the shelf when he was the warden over there, his walking stick, pictures, his Bible, his psalm book, they're all there. And then I came across some of his railroading information, and he was a business partner with Jim Hill of James J. Hill fame, and so I came across a lot of papers from that, and the Minnesota Historical Society has a fairly extensive railroad history collection, so I passed a lot of those papers on there. And really was how FR worked with the Dutch investors, and also how he helped Hill get in control of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, which he had at that point retired from, but he was still very active as a railroad man.
So can you backtrack a little bit and
Yes.
just tell us about him?
Oh, absolutely.
What
In
did he
fact,
do and how
I
did he get-
can backtrack even farther,
Okay.
because I think you'd be interested to know the name Delano, where it came from,
Right.
and why. How did it get to this country?
Yeah.
Because that in itself is a fascinating story. So, I won't go back to the way back, but the first Delano was a fellow by the name of Philippe Delanois, and Philippe and his parents were Walloons, and they were Protestants, and they had left what is now northern France, but it was essentially Wallonia or Flanders at that time, and they escaped religious persecution, went to Canterbury in England. So his parents and his grandparents were raised there, and then they decided that they wanted to go back to the continent, so they went back to Leiden, because Holland at that time was a fairly free, open country, so that they could practice their religion without any fear of persecution whatsoever, which was not the case where they had come from. And they really wanted to be back in Europe. So Philippe was born in 1602 in Leiden, and he was christened 1603. You can see the actual church in the plaque where he was. It tells you that. And he grew up there, and his family were involved in the English separatists, the Pilgrims, at the time. And when the Pilgrims decided that they needed to leave Holland and come to the New World, he came along. So Philippe went on the Speedwell. Well, we know the Speedwell didn't quite make it to England, so he came the following year on the Fortune and landed in Plymouth in 1621.
Amazing.
And lived in Plymouth for about till 1627. Then he moved across the bay to my town, Duxbury, Mass, and was a founder of Duxbury. The family has been in Duxbury literally since 1627. Some family members. So, how do we get to FR?
Yeah, how did Francis get out here?
Well,
Did he get out here? I
yes,
heard
he did.
He did. Okay.
Oh gosh, yes. Oh,
Okay.
more so than you would ever know. What he did was the family stayed in Massachusetts, and it has a long story. I'll skip the generations, but his father moved the family to Southern Illinois in the early 1840s, and FR would have been in like 1718. Found a wife there. Callista Cavender was her name, and they got married in 1846. Had a couple children. Unfortunately, neither of them survived infancy. So he came up to what was then St. Anthony in 1848. The government from before selling the army had a grain mill in St. Anthony, and he actually ran the grain mill for a while until the company that he worked for lost the contract. At that point, he said, "I like it here. I'm going to stay here." So he went out to Stillwater and got in the logging business. And when the territorial government decided it needed a prison, he and a group of 2 partners decided to bid for this prison, and they got the work. So they built the prison, the warden's house in Stillwater, and he became warden then, appointed by Alexander Ramsey in 1853, and was warden of the territorial prison from 1853 until Minnesota became a state in 1858. At that point, he went back to logging, but he had decided that railroading was really where his interests were. He always seemed to be kind of at the head of the curve. He'd had a lot of interest in steam engines. He'd worked, actually in Massachusetts, he had worked on a railroad, the Boston and Worcester Railroad at that time. And so it was in his, it was in his blood, as it were. So he got involved in the railroad, and the St. Paul and Pacific was just being formed in 1860. And by 1862, he became general superintendent of the first division of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. And the problem was the railroad, there was no railroad. It was in St. Paul. So you had to build this railroad. So he was an engineer by background, I think. He always listed himself as a civil engineer. If you look at the census, he was listed as civil engineer. I mean, he was a businessman too, but I think his greater strength lies as a civil engineer. So he then proceeded with the resources of the St. Paul Pacific Railroad, plan the line out west.
Was his education at Dartmouth?
No,
Where'd he go?
Amherst.
Amherst, okay.
Yeah, he grew up in Amherst. His parents moved the whole family there to Amherst in about 1833, and he went through Amherst Academy.
Okay.
But he didn't go on to college. Believe it or not, I mean, and you don't mind if I digress a little bit, because there's some interesting digressions there. His older brother, Charles, stayed and went through college, got a law degree, and became a lawyer. And what was interesting about Charles, he stayed in the area, but then decided that, well, the whole family turned Republican in the late 1850s. And Charles decided he was going to run for Congress, and he ran for Congress, represented Western Massachusetts. And what was interesting about Charles was that was the time of the start of the Civil War. And Charles was on both the military affairs and the Washington, D.C. committee. And the thing that I'll always remember, and I've looked into his grave a couple times, but he actually was at the Battle of Bull Run. If you've ever heard the story about all the carriages leaving Washington to go out and watch this big battle, and then unfortunately the Confederates pushed the Union Army back, and everything was just a pandemonium to get back to Washington. Well, he was in the pandemonium to get back. But anyway, back out to FR, he then planned the railroad. So he platted most of these towns and the rail line all the way out, and then organized the construction of it. And so, first thing you got to get to St. Anthony or Minneapolis later. He did that, and then it was out west. And so he got out to Wayzata. If you look up the reports, he got out to Wayzata in about 1867, and to this area not too long after that, late 1867. So yeah, he was out here, and he was out here quite a bit. He would ride the railroad to supervise the construction, and as it went further and further west.
And where did he get the workers?
A lot of Scandinavians, a lot of Irish. Yeah.
Because this area seems to be a lot of German.
Yes. And some
Czech
Polish too.
and Polish,
Yeah. Well, what they did was, remember, and this was told to me by Dwayne Swenson, who was not any longer, but he was sort of the head of the railroad history of the Minnesota Historical Society. When they platted these towns, they essentially put a town about every 8 miles. And so Minnesota had offices, certainly in New York, and when the ships came in, they would recruit immigrants off these ships, and they'd say, we're building a town here. We need farmers, we need laborers, we need shopkeepers, we need blacksmith, whatever they need, and you know, it's like, great, fine, and they would ship them out here, and that's why all these towns have a little bit of a different ethnic makeup or national makeup, and so that explains a lot, and then
you're saying every 8 miles or so, that's because they had to have water towers.
water and wood
Yeah.
for the engines, and also they kind of figured that, you know, that's about as far as people want to go between stops, I think. Investors, senior managers of the railroad company, places like Litchfield and Roanoke and Breckenridge and Moorhead and on out to North Dakota and Montana. So it's quite interesting. How he got, you know, how he was named for this, I think it has to do with, you know, just how much he had done or how much he had contributed that the railroad and the legislature really decided to name this town after him. That's been my only. And I think you maybe know better than I thought it was like 1870 or 1871 that the name was
The name
changed
changed?
to Delano.